It's time to talk about something disgusting, and it is the new Nurgle roster reveal that we just got landed to us today. We'll be going through the entire roster with the legendary lords, the lords and heroes, going into the units, cav, artillery, everything that is included in this roster. Now, this will be a bit different than my usual kind of format of going through this. I don't have the actual blog post, just the text. So what I'm going to be showing you guys are all of the pictures from the blog post, and I'll be talking over them. So you won't be actually be able to see it, but hopefully you can just kind of follow along with what I'm saying. And I'll be reading directly from that blog post again, but like I said, unfortunately, I will not have that post, just a Word document I'm reading off of. And I figure that these pictures is probably a little bit more enjoyable than looking at a Word document, because I think we all sat through those presentations already in our earlier scholastic life and don't want to do it again. So let's dive here into the Nurgle roster. But before we do, guys, as always, don't forget to comment, like, and or subscribe if you do enjoy the video. And if you have not yet pre-ordered Total War Warhammer 3, you can do so using the Nexus link in my description. It gets you a Steam key directly from the developer, and it is a great way to support the channel. And I usually do like kind of like an upfront, down and dirty, like what this video is going to be about, but it's a roster reveal, so there's nothing really to paraphrase. I guess the big things I can paraphrase for you are the Lord options are a Herald of Nurgle and an Exalted Great Unclean One, which will of course also have a Great Unclean One as a non-Lord option. And then for heroes, we get a Cultist of Nurgle and the Plague Ridden. As far as infantry goes, we do not get any actual Nurgle Warriors of Chaos, and that might be something you're really curious about and you don't want to wait through the whole video to learn, so I'll just tell you that up front. It's pretty much going to be entirely demons or demon-themed mortal units like Forsaken. So that's my little bit of upfront information for the video for you. If that's all you want to know, like I've said before, I don't mind if you go ahead and shut the video down if you just wanted that down and dirty dip. But let's get started here on the Total War Warhammer 3 Nurgle roster. And who better to start than with the big Plague Daddy himself, Kugoth Plaguefather. And I'm not going to read every single little lore blurb for all of them, but I just want to jump through this one for Kugoth because he is, again, a really important character. So, whilst other Great Unclean Ones work to spread the plagues already extant, Kugoth the Plaguefather is fascinated by the breeding of new and virulent life. Kugoth aims to one day breed a contagion that can infect the gods themselves. It's called COVID. The Plaguefather rides upon a massive palanquin bedecked with alchemical paraphernalia, vials full of seething powder, flasks of indescribable liquid, and Hessian sacks stuffed to bursting with Nurglings. This great bulk is held aloft by a carpet of straining Nurglings, and Kugoth is attended on by countless others, all bred from the Plaguefather's pox vats. So you've got a pretty good idea of, you know, how disgusting he is. And we already saw him in the trailer. We saw his his mighty corpulence looking all nice and hot and heavy. And it's cool to see that palanquin. Obviously, Creative Assembly's like, well, let's put all the money towards Kugoth's palanquin, and we'll just give Greasus a like Fast and Furious modified wagon for his fat ass. I'm stoked about it. So let's see. Also, some of his mechanics are pretty interesting too, because he actually acts as an artillery piece. This is very unique for a starting Lord, right? You know, we also have this with the Tomb Kings, right? You can get what's his name on his Roomba, and he can start shooting as an artillery piece for the Tomb Kings. But with Kugoth, he starts immediately like that. It says right here, in battle, Kugoth operates as the campaign's earliest available artillery piece, hurling explosive Nurglings across half the map to detonate in the ranks of his enemies. He's an expert spellcaster in the lore of Nurgle, a uniquely powerful demon summoner who can bring more of the explosive Nurglings on the battlefield, and one very smelly boy. So what you would obviously expect here. Also, too, he is a greater demon, so he's still going to be pretty potent in combat, but he is a greater demon of Nurgle, so he's not going to be going, you know, toe-to-toe with Khorne, but he still will be quite strong. I would imagine, too, that we are going to see a lot of defensive or sustain abilities for Nurgle, right? He's probably going to have some sort of passive ability, as all Nurgle, I assume, would, that allows him to have increased stayability, either increased physical resistance, melee defense, higher health pools, whatever it is that Nurgle's going to have, just like Tzeentch has got Protoss barriers. and so on and so forth. So that covers Big Daddy Kugoth here. He does have the lore of Nurgle as mentioned, and his mounts are none, but he rides a Nurgling palanquin as default, so that is his mount. So moving here into our just standard lords, we have the Herald of Nurgle, which is just going to essentially be just like we have for everyone else, just the Herald character, and it is going to have the Lord of Nurgle or the Lore of Death, and it will fly a Rotfly or be on a Nurgle palanquin. So a nice two set of mount options here. The other one we get is the Exalted Great Unclean One. So basically your Great Unclean One, but with a really cool little hat. And it gets access to the Lore of Nurgle or the Lore of Death, as again, you would expect. So moving into the heroes, we get the Cultist of Nurgle. Every single lord or god up to this point has had a Cultist variant. So now we get the Cultist of Nurgle here. And Cultists exist to spread the corruption of their god, Nurgle in particular. His most devoted servants carry plagues and worse the world over, infiltrating towns and armies who use their very bodies as fuel for the spread of his glorious gifts. These plague cultists exist purely for that purpose, outside of the normal deployment of cultists. While normal cultists can serve in battle, they are a stronger force wandering the world, spreading corruption, sabotaging enemy plans, scouting, and generally making a rotten nuisance of themselves. And we already talked about this in the campaign mechanics for Nurgle, how these cultists will play very heavily into the spreading of these plagues, and how you've got, okay, the base plagues with the symptoms to then maybe use a recipe for a very classic or very well-known plague like the Nurgle's Rot, Black Pox, stuff like that. So really, really awesome mechanics there for the cultists. And lastly, we get a Plague Ridden, which is essentially like a Plague Bearer, but better. Let's see here. There it is. So they get access to the Lore of Nurgle or the Lore of Death, and that they can also fly a Rotfly or be a Nurgling go onto a Nurgling palanquin. So here's an interesting bit right here. It says a Plague Ridden is also a caster, destroying enemies through magical infection and disease as much as physical, because they are a little bit of a hybrid hero choice in that they have the access to the Lore of Nurgle or Lore of Death, but they're also competent enough in combat to do some good damage here. So it's cool to see the the mount choices for the lords and heroes, right? Rotfly, palanquin. Nothing. I was kind of surprised here to see if with the cultists they didn't just have like a base horse or something like that, a demonic steed. But still, nonetheless, looking pretty good here in the heroes and lords section. More mounts than Kislev, I can say that. So let's move now into the units, starting with the infantry. To start us off in the unit section, we have the Nurglings. And this is where we find out about what the Mark of Nurgle means in Total War Warhammer. So Nurglings have, well, again, the Mark of Nurgle, and it means that all Nurglish demons, so everything except Forsaken and Spawn, share a couple of traits. Poison attacks and Cloud of Flies both represent the constant sickliness and aura of disease that surrounds them. The latter increases the melee defense of the unit if they're in extended melee combat. So, Cloud of Flies is either like a timed tier type of buff, right? Where, okay, the longer you're in combat, the more melee defense you get. Or if you're in combat after a certain amount of time, then you get the melee defense buff. It's probably going to be one or the other. And it's cool to see poison attacks, because remember how poison attacks work in this game is they do sap the fighting capabilities of anyone who gets poisoned, right? It slows them down, reduces their charge speed, reduces their weapon strength and their range weapon strength. So cool to see how poison attacks are going to kind of play into the Lore of Nurgle here. Also, all demons also share the cause fear and physical resistance traits, as well as granting them immunity to terror and routing and causing damage when leadership drops. Nurglings may deploy far out from the main force with vanguard deployment because they are good little lads, just about absolute champs. So the physical resistance that innately comes with demonhood will be present right on the Lore of Nurgle units. They don't seem to be getting any kind of physical resistance buff because they are Lore of Nurgle. And it looks like it's going to be melee defense, and I would assume HP pool, because we're going to talk about Plague Bearers in a little bit, that will kind of become the trademarks of Nurgle. So talking about the Plague Bearers, we get a heavier hitting force, a slower, heavier hitting unit. So what they lack in armor and skill, Plague Bearers make up for in pure strength and health. They are blobs of flesh ready to absorb the enemy and strike back. In general, Nurgle's armies are slow, the plot of an oncoming inevitable death, and Plague Bearers are some of the slowest. No matter how nicely they ask, do not hug. I'm not going to hug them, don't worry about it. But We do know, of course, that means that we're probably going to see high weapon strength on these guys. Very slow movement characteristic as to be expected, probably very minimal in their charge attack, but a good amount of melee defense from the cloud of flies, which seems to be a very high health pool from this description, and then their poison attack. So it should be very interesting to see how these guys actually play out. I would assume that they might have a lower melee attack, just as a result, needing to kind of have some bit of balance here. But we then get the Forsaken of Nurgle to kind of balance that out, right? You've got your slower, meatier tank force, with the Forsaken probably allowing you to do a lot of flanking maneuvers or just kind of get a lot of good shock, not shock cav, but shock charges in there. So as you would expect, it is a Forsaken unit, so everything that is intrinsically there with Forsaken, such as Frenzy, Cause Fear, and Immunopsychology, is going to be present with the Nurgle ones. As one of the few non-demonic units, Forsaken cover an important role in Nurgle armies as hardy and quick-moving forces. Significantly lower melee defense and health than Plague Bearers, giving you a choice of ways to destroy your enemies. So, I don't think this will have the Cloud of Flies, but I would assume it has poison attacks or something that makes it Nurgle-y. To kind of, fall in line with the fact that it is a Forsaken of Nurgle, because it says earlier in the Nurgling section, all Nurglish demons, so everything except Forsaken and Spawn, share a couple of traits. So I would assume it probably has poison attacks just to make it that more Nurgle touch on Forsaken. Moving into the Exalted Plague Bearers of Nurgle, we get the bigger, badder, stronger versions of their little tiny cousins. And bigger, stronger, and more powerful Plague Bearers, the Exalted also sport a special ranged weapon, throwing small versions of the Death's Head at enemies as they close. This has armor-piercing projectiles, but a very limited ammunition count. This also poisons like almost everything Nurgle does. This weakens speed and damage of any unit affected. So this kind of like a Roman Legionnaire Pilum, right? You're throwing this out right at the very beginning, right before you get into the actual combat, so it gives them a little bit of punch before they actually jump in to do that melee damage that I assume is going to be very bloated. No Nurgle pun intended there from the Plague Bearers. But that covers just the Nurgle infantry. The next section here is monsters and beasts, and it's interesting to see that the rest of the roster is monsters and beasts. So hang tight here. This next section is going to be quite the girthy one. And we'll start pretty slow here with the Chaos Furies of Nurgle. So these guys are going to give you a little bit of fast attack, a little bit of harass from the Nurgle army, which is of course going to be their Achilles heel. They're going to be very, very slow for the exception of Plague Toads and Pox Riders slash Rot Flies in some variation, shape, or form. So we'll take a look at those in just a second here, but as you would expect, this thing is a pretty normal unit of Chaos. I always want to say furries. There's Chaos Furries everywhere, a whole convention of them. So Chaos Furies of Nurgle, but they have poison attacks, so it's going to give them some nice harass capability. But we also get the Beast of Nurgle, as we saw, which is a disgusting reggae version of Nurgle Great Unclean One. But this big old badass is going to be able to regenerate flesh, because it's going to have regenerative capabilities, oozing slime in all directions. Even as it sits still, this magic dings to enemies and slows them down. So it'll be very interesting to see that that slime will probably be a persistent effect, but I wouldn't be surprised if it has an activatable that allows it just to like shoot a bunch of slime, disease, cloud, whatever it is all around it to do like an AoE bit of damage. And it didn't seem to be a huge creature, right? It looks more in line with a Exalted Flamer of Tzeentch as far as relative size goes. So we get that present here in the Nurgle roster. Some sort of not massive beast creature, but a pretty good larger size single entity that can do some damage and kind of add the army strength into a smaller single entity package, right? The Flamer of Tzeentch is a great way to get Warp Flame out. That Beast of Nurgle is probably going to be a great way to do a lot of poisoning. Moving into the Plague Toads of Nurgle, which I'm stoked to see on the roster. Really excited about this. Hopefully we might see a Tamarcon DLC that adds the Toad Dragon, which would be so cool. So we saw the Plague Toads, and we also saw some toads being ridden by Plague Bearers. So I don't know if we're going to have two different options here, because I'm looking at the actual roster and I don't see anything here. Plague Drones, Spawn of Nurgle, Pox Riders of Nurgle. Yes, I don't see anything particularly of... oh, no, Pox Riders of Nurgle are on the Plague Toad. Sorry, I was thinking of the plague drones are the plague bearers on rotflies, and I thought that the Poxrider was that. So my bad, I got that mixed up in my head. But plague toads are just simply the toads, versus Poxriders are toads with plague bearers on top of them. So for the plague toads of Nurgle here, they take the role of light cav or powerful war beasts from another army, though with their own unique gait and feel. We'll smash aside lighter units with pure body weight, giving them an anti-infantry profile, and on the cheaper and speedier side for Nurgle. So again, giving them a little bit more of terrestrial speed as opposed to the Fury that we saw a little bit ago, and the Rotflies, which we're about to talk about next here. So Rotflies, we've seen them now as a mount so far, but they're going to be acting as a fast-moving, armor-piercing flying unit that makes a powerful Nurgle piece when combined with other units. Taking the opportunity to highlight our new flying toggle, which works as well with the Rotflies as any other flying melee unit. Okay, interesting. So the Rotflies will be able to land, which is not something I would have expected. See what happens when you aren't nice to Beasts of Nurgle. Look what you did. You gave it anxiety. So we do have Rotflies, we do get Plague Toads. That gives us a little bit of mobility. Probably not the most, right? I don't expect the Plague Toads to be a 76, 96 speed thing. Even though it says light cav, I'd be pretty surprised if it had a full 96 speed. I could see it being a little bit lower. And again, with Rotflies and the Poxriders, that gives us a little bit of mobility that the army otherwise would lack, I would say. So then next up, we have the Poxriders of Nurgle now. Again, remember, a Poxrider is a plague toad with a plague bearer on top. So I would imagine this is going to be kind of a bit of the heavier cav. I don't know if it's going to have an increased characteristic, armor, melee defense, whatever it is, but it'll have, of course, some sort of good charge bonus attached to it. It'll now have the weapon strength characteristic or bonus now of having a plague bearer on top, some additional damage. So these are going to be the guys that are going to get up close and personal and do a lot of that shock cav role for you. And it does say unlikely to outpace other cavalry on over large infected toads, but they'll give it their best shot. So it does kind of create that notion that these guys aren't going to be the fastest option for cavalry in the game, but they're definitely going to get their job done. Moving into the spawn of Nurgle, we have another generic chaos unit, just Nurglified, and it does get poison attacks, so that will be its kind of trademark when it comes to Nurgle itself. Over Nurgle's other forces, spawn offer a significantly higher weapon strength and speed than most troops, which will be kind of nice here. And their high health will allow them to work really well with Nurgle's other troops and access to various healing effects. We still don't know what the lore of Nurgle includes, right? We don't know every single spell. Usually this roster reveal does give us that, so it is kind of interesting to know that, okay, well, we do have a lore of Nurgle, but it's going to be, we're not necessarily 100% sure how that is going to fill out this high health, high melee defense, poison attack causing army. I would imagine there's going to be something that kind of does a little bit of a tick with that. So moving into the next unit, we've got the Plague Drones of Nurgle, and these now are Rotflies with a Plague Bearer on top. So a little confusing nomenclature there, but still nonetheless. And we get two different variants. So Flying War Beast and then the Death's Head variant. So kind of like a semi-ranged variant, right? So Death's Head variant gives a powerful but low ammunition range attack to help to soften targets. And one extra angry bile-spewing demon per Rotfly adds a mixture of additional stats to the mix. So this will be a pretty, I think, of the roster, the Plague Drone will be extremely devastating. At least I would hope it would be very devastating. I would expect it to be doing a lot of damage with the combination of the Rotfly and the Plague Bearer. And those Death's Head, I imagine it's going to be as devastating as like Deckhand Bombers were when the Vampire Coast first came out. And they were just like so brutal up in the air for a little bit until they kind of got a little bit of a nerf. So I expect that to be kind of the case here with Plague Drones of Nurgle. Our last two units, the first one being the Great Unclean One, is going to have access to the lore of Nurgle as you would expect, and it is, well, a Great Unclean One, so giant armor-piercing strikes can cut through fortress doors as easily as flesh. And even though this blog post kind of makes it out to seem like Nurgle isn't the best in combat, I would still expect it to be quite competent. Khorne is always going to be, right, that pinnacle. Slaanesh is extremely fast, but Nurgle does have, attached to its slowness, a good amount of strength and durability. So I expect still a Great Unclean One to be pretty scary on the battlefield. Then lastly, we get our Soul Grinder, which, I'm sorry, is in its own section of Nurgle missile monsters and beasts, but still, it's the last one here. And the Nurgle variant of the terrifying Soul Grinder can vomit gobs of poisonous material at artillery ranges to destroy formations, maintains great melee capabilities of other variants, making it a fantastic all-rounder. All other Nurgle passives make it harder in combat too. So it will have poison attacks then, right? It'll have the flies that'll fly around it and increase its melee defense. It'll act as an artillery piece, and it'll be a really good melee combatant. So this one will be very interesting to see. I'm stoked to see all 4 of the Soul Grinders lined up to look at the stat differences and to kind of test each one out. Like, hey, this one does really well in this scenario, or this one does better in this scenario. Because, of course, each one's going to have its specific gods marked that will make it beneficial in certain cases. But I just really want to see how that all looks across the board. That covers everything here for our Nurgle roster. Go ahead and let me know in the comment section below what you're excited about, what you think is missing here. Again, this is a Chaos Demon army, so the lack of presence of the Warriors of Chaos here isn't necessarily surprising, especially because we've seen it now between everything except for Khorne. But I really do want to see Khorne, Nurgle, Slaanesh, Tzeentch, warriors, like true tried and true warriors. So hopefully we get some sort of update to the Warriors of Chaos Undivided, and that's when we start to see stuff like that with the ability to add marks to them and what have you. Maybe in the same system that you've got with like the greenskin scrap mechanic, right? Where you can just kind of pop those on after you've created the unit. Well, I'd love if Warriors of Chaos had that. Okay, you can pop open their quote-unquote scrap mechanic and just add a mark to them, and boom, there you go. You're playing Undivided, and you're just basically adding on these marks. I think that's probably a really cool way to take an existing system, pop it into the Warriors of Chaos, and make it work really well. But as always, guys, thank you so much for watching here today. Again, let me know what you're feeling in the comment section below. Are you stoked for Nurgle? Are you not? For me, I think Nurgle might be the first campaign I play that is not like Kislev or Cathay. I'm really, really excited to play those two, because I've seen Chaos Demons for editions and editions and editions, but I've never seen anything with Cathay up until Total War Warhammer 3, and Kislev has been something that's kind of bounced in and out of lore and rules for so many years that it's going to be fun to actually see something a little more concrete. But one last time, as always, thank you so much for watching here today. Have a good one, and take care.